Hello, everyone. I'm James Kilgore. I'm a Building Community Power Fellow at Community Justice Exchange, where I've been working on creating zines with a theme of international solidarity. So today I'll be in conversation with Leigh-Ann Naidoo, who is the centerpiece for our second zine, Tensions Across the Sea, the story of a freedom flotilla from South Africa to Palestine. This is the second zine in an international solidarity series called A Luta Continua. But before we get started, I want to give you a little background on Leigh-Ann, who is an amazing activist on many fronts in South Africa. Leigh-Ann is an educationalist who works at the University of Cape Town School of Education. She also has been an athlete. She represented South Africa in beach volleyball at the 2004 Athens Olympics, where she was one of a handful of out queer Olympians. She has worked inside and outside of the formal education system. She was involved in the mobilizations in South Africa, known by the hashtag Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall, struggles that form part of the uh, and formed part of the 2016 All Women International Flotilla mission that attempted to break the Israeli blockade of Gaza. She is interested in knowledge production outside the confines of the academic project and is working collectively to try and develop daily pedagogy that confronts the violences that are the reality of the majority of people on the planet, and to work towards some form of resistance and repair. She also continues to be involved in reimagining the university as an institution with the potential to radically change society. As you can see, Leigh-Ann will have a lot to say in this conversation. Welcome, Leigh-Ann. It's great to be with you.
Hi, James. Good to be with you and to those who will tune in to listen at some point.
Okay, so I touched on quite a bit of your history, but I wanted to know to begin with how you came to be connected with Palestinian liberation.
Yeah, thanks. It's so strange to be named an activist because it's not something that when I grew up I understood myself to be participating in. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a home where my family was committed to the anti-apartheid struggle. My father is a socialist, and so in a way, um, being named an activist is almost like an anomaly because I didn't understand that what I was growing up and being invited in some instances and dragged along to in others was actually a form of what we call now activism. And the Palestinian struggle was just one of many struggles that my father, my family, and our community, the community of political activists that we were part of. I think many people know the apartheid struggle in South Africa to be linked to the Palestinian one, not only because these come into kind of formal legal, there's a moment in that 1948 moment that we share with Palestine, but also quite a few of my family members and political activists who I would consider to be a generation above me would speak quite interchangeably about fighting various forms of oppression and fighting it in different parts of the world. So whenever there were protests and when I was much younger, I would go along and I would listen to and be part of, sometimes kind of unwillingly and unwittingly learning about what was going on in different parts of the world. So in that sense, it's almost in a weird way, I was socialized and naturally part of this in a way. I know it's a weird thing to say, but that's how it felt. So it didn't feel like something that I was sitting down to learn about. It felt like I was learning about it through being with people, older people in particular, who were already part of a broader movement. So in that sense, I was socialized, inducted into it. I'm now grateful for it. At the time when I was maybe a teenager, even younger, I think I was a bit more resistant. I have a 16-year-old kid who I'm sure is going to have very similar things to say later on in life.
Right, right. So it's interesting to hear you talk about that because, I mean, part of the reason for doing this project is the fact that the I'm more of your father's generation in terms of activism, and I mean we also, even in the US, we had that global perspective. We talked about Palestine, we talked about Vietnam, we talked about Central America and Southern Africa and other parts of Africa. And I kind of noticed, particularly in the movement around mass incarceration, that international perspective was kind of it was kind of disappearing. And
Mm.
I think the resistance that came in support of Palestine in the last couple of years in the U.S. has at least sparked some of that, but there's still very little kind of international awareness of what's going on in other parts of the world. So I just wanted to kind of retrace some of that history in this particular project. So the zine tells the story of a flotilla, of which you were a part of. A boat, was it one boat or was it more than one boat?
No, it was one boat, and this one was a woman's, all women's boat, which was the first time that that had been launched. I mean, the flotilla movement to break the illegal blockade of Gaza has been ongoing, as many people will know. But this one was 13 women. In it started out with two boats, but by the time I got on halfway through the journey in Italy, it had whittled down to one. I mean, along the way there was so much sabotage by the Israeli government, putting pressure on various governments where we would need to dock, that we ended up being just one boat.
Okay, and so you came on in Italy, but the boat itself had gone from South Africa to Italy.
No, the boat had started in, oh, where did it start? It started 8 days before. I'm forgetting exactly where the first part of the journey started. I got on halfway in Italy, so it was in the Mediterranean basically. So it was, altogether, I think the mission took about 17 or 18 days, but I got on halfway. And one of the things that didn't really make it into the media was that the mission was planned two boats, about 25 people. And then by the time they got to Messina, one of the boats were unable to continue. And so we had to reduce the amount of people that could actually go onto that last leg. So we ended up being one boat, and I ended up on it for 9 days,
Mm.
which was quite long in the end.
Okay, and so I mean, how was your experience of being on the boat and what was the kind of group dynamics, and also what was there? I know at one point that you were actually intercepted by the Israeli occupation force, but was there other kinds of harassment or interference with the flotilla along the
Yeah.
way?
So it the kind of the group dynamics. We were in Messina in Italy, and at that point we were, as I mentioned, there had to be some kind of selection because of the reduction of boats, and the exact reason for the second boat being excluded wasn't quite clear, except that it was having difficulty along the way, and some people had we literally were guarding boats. That's how um, prepared we had to try to be, and how much we expected that the Israelis would try to actually intervene before even the defense force boarded our boat. So the dynamics were interesting because we were such a internationalist group. So there were women from more than 25 countries, a huge group of support and administrative and kind of technical support around trying to sail on what everyone, I think, in my mind, when I think Mediterranean, I think calm ocean. I don't know why that was the image that I had in my head, only to really find out that that particular the Mediterranean Sea is landlocked, and so the kind of I almost say turbulence in the air sense, but the kind of seasickness and buoyancy is quite extreme. So it made me think quite carefully and more critically about what it means to get onto a boat in that part of the world and try to cross. I mean, I think I was a bit naive in terms of what it means to be at sea. I don't know if you've been at sea, but I had to learn a lot quite quickly. But in terms of the group dynamics, very diverse. lots of excitement when we were on land about having made it halfway through, having met with the women who were on the boat before us, and so learning from their experience. So there's a lot of conversation, engagement. And then once we were on the boat and had left, I mean, the thing is, when you do a team activity, when there's been a lot of preparation, anticipation, and there's also a little bit of, not a little bit, quite a bit of fear around what you might confront, that sense of, I would say, solidarity, collectivity was actually really beautiful to start out that journey with. I remember regretting being so overconfident on the first day as we sailed off and people were waving and there was a massive Palestinian flag in the port. As we were sailing out, I think for about an hour or two, I was saying, wow, this is probably the most beautiful and idyllic form of activism I've ever done, because it was a beautiful scene and we were not yet out at sea. I very quickly regretted, and we had a good laugh, because once we started getting into I keep thinking turbulence. I don't know why I'm thinking, what's the word at sea? Uh,
Oh, let's
swell,
call it. There you go.
swell. And once we got out there, I was really eating my words, to be honest with you, and starting to realize more actually what it takes to be away from land and on sea.
And so, I mean, at what point did you, at what point did the Israelis begin to be, did it become kind of obvious that they were likely to come on board, or was it a complete surprise, or how did
Yeah.
that?
So people will remember that the Mavera, which was a Turkish boat that had gone a couple of years before, the Israeli Defense Force or Occupation Force had actually attacked that boat and killed people. So there have been multiple float. That was the most extreme response that had come from Israel. But always force was used in flotilla missions to bully people, to prevent people from actually completing the mission. So we had that in memory. And before we got on the last leg, we did have some engagements around what to do, because we were very clearly unarmed, and people were being cautious about not uh, provoking uh, this massive military force. And so in a sense, we already were anticipating and engaging with, in our minds and in role plays, the possibility of this violent force actually coming on board. But we went out of the 9 days, they were nowhere to be seen. They were clearly watching us. But that fear and the threat, and knowing that it was very likely that they were going to stop us from achieving what we had set out, which was, in this instance, the flotilla mission wasn't taking any aid. We were basically going so that we could meet, so that we could take a message of solidarity, and some people were saying a message of hope, connection to the outside world, to Gaza. So in a sense, we were always aware that they were around the corner and that they were likely to try to stop us. But we didn't see them at all for 8 of the 9 days. And it was only when we got really close to actually arriving in Gaza that we saw two massive military ships, basically on either side of us on the horizon, emerge. We were still in international waters, but emerge and then follow us and be alongside us. So the threat became material as we came closer.
Uh-huh. Okay, and then what was the next step?
So so before we get there, we discuss the two eventualities. One, that we were going to be interfered with, and there would be an intervention by the Israeli occupation forces. And in that instance, prepare for them boarding us, taking over the ship, and then arresting us and deporting us potentially. The second one was, if we do arrive in Gaza, how do we arrive in what is structurally one of the most violent and kind of excluded, imprisoned civilian populations in the world. So we had a bit of, as we came closer, we had conversations about how we would deal with those two situations. And inside of that conversation, we agreed that we would, in the one instance, cede our voices and not really engage the Israeli occupation forces if they board us. That our ship captain, who was a woman who was an all-ship or all-vessel captain, she's dealt with radio communication and is an activist that does some of these crazy mid-sea activist activities, that she would speak to the military captain, and that our political boat leader, who was a retired and is actually doing quite, and I forget her surname, but she was doing quite amazing work now. She's a retired US colonel who's a peace activist and has been going on these flotilla missions for a long time, that she would speak also as our leader. So in that instance, we were in agreement that we would cede and manage our capture, or that people who had the experience would help manage that. The part that didn't go down so well was when we discussed what would happen if the Israeli Defense Force doesn't intervene and we land in Gaza. How do we approach the people, especially the women we are going to connect with? And it was in this moment that, even before the Israeli occupation forces intervened and brought external pressure on us, pressure started building on the boat itself, because we had different perspectives about what the message was. The message we agreed was about solidarity and connection and international messaging and commitment to support for ongoing struggle. But some of the activists on the boat were quite clear that they were going to spread the message of peace, and in that implied a suggestion that the way to resolve this ongoing tension and occupation was through peace. And so, we have the military, before the military boats even come, this becomes something that builds on the boat. And when they eventually do arrive and so the negotiation between the military vessels and us go on for about 3, 4, 5 hours. So when you're at sea, I learned that time is it's a totally different thing at sea. And also how you just manage to stay alive is a different thing. So you have to deal with nausea. And I mean, there were so many things that happened prior to us actually being abducted that really pushed us together in a sense. When you struggle with people and your physical limits are pushed, you kind of things get real and people get kind of honest very quickly. And so we got to a point even before they boarded us, where we were becoming much more familiar, much more kind of honest and engaging with each other. And quite a few people were quite ill for a couple of days on the boat. And there were 2 or 3 activists who were over 65, 70 years old. So, we were looking out for each other. We were building a form of camaraderie very quickly, being together. But then when we get boarded, we now have, there were 13 of us on this yacht boat, not a yacht boat, and about the same number of soldiers then board us. And what's interesting in that moment is, at least I start realizing, besides the military might, which about the Israeli army, they are massively funded by the US and they have all this technology. So you kind of prepare yourself for that. But what was quite interesting immediately when we came into beyond the radio contact, when they now started to say, we've tried to negotiate with you, you don't want to listen, so now we're going to use force to stop you from what you're wanting to do. And that, like I say, went on for a couple of hours. We were all quiet, sitting there listening to the radio communications and the threat of we're going to intervene, and using language that was not quite clear saying that we're just going to board you. And they were actually using quite threatening language, which I imagine people who are on the receiving end of communication with the IDF are used to. So we're listening to this. We're not saying anything back. They then approach us. They then board us. They then take over the steering of the boat we were on. What I start to notice is that as important as the physical taking over of whatever you're trying to do, is the documenting and controlling. You can see that the controlling of the narrative is as important as the kind of military might. So alongside of us are these boats. They're called Zodiacs. They have these machine guns on them, and they're rubber ducks. They move quite quickly. There are two of them that pull up aside. Soldiers get on board, and then they alongside us. And there's a soldier with a zoom lens camera. There's a soldier with a zoom lens video camera, and every soldier has a GoPro on them, much like your police has. So they are really documenting everything from multiple angles and able to then package them or retell or claim the narrative of what's happening. And so alongside their presence is also, you can actually feel that they are going to use whatever they've captured in the service of their narrative. They also take everyone's phones. We had an Al Jazeera crew with us. They confiscate everything that you can possibly use to record what's happening. And then they take our food away from us, and they're on the boat with us for about another 6, 7, 8 hours, because we now got to go into Israel where they take us and imprison us. And so we're on the boat with these soldiers, and they take our food, they take everything away, and then slowly they start talking to us or trying to talk to us. Slowly they start bringing food onto the boat, putting it in the communal area where they had confined us in the boat, after looking through everything and throwing everything upside down. And then they start providing people with food. And in this was one of the moments where I also didn't keep quiet. I know we were supposed to keep quiet, but, we boycott Israeli goods as part of an international boycott. And here we're on a boat. We can see where Gaza is. The military's on board with us. They've taken our food. They're giving us food. They've got cameras there. And you just know that. And so some activists were hungry and so started eating the food. And at that point, I was like, we can't do this, people. We boycott Israeli products. Why would we eat this food now? Because it was quite clear that they were going to say, we treated people well, we fed them, and so on. And we know that that's actually a strategy. So once they boarded us, they then took us to the Ashdod, to the port, and then to prison. And it is in that moment that I also realized that even growing up under apartheid, and knowing the segregationist laws, policies, and policing of all of that, I knew about checkpoints. I'd seen videos. I understood it in my consciousness. But then to arrive and really experience this thing, for me, was a huge learning experience. So this question of experience and what that does to what we think is knowing or consciousness was really interesting. So what is very normal or regular for Palestinians, of strip searching, of having to interface with all of these forces or armed or militarized or securitized forces of the state, we kind of arrived to it. So we were with the military, with the Navy, and there was this entire tent set up for us to process us in a manner where you could just feel the tick boxing exercise of human rights. Here's the military, here's the prison service, here's the Navy, here's the police force, here's the immigration office. All the infrastructure is like buzzing around 13 of us, and they are now processing us into their system. But going through that and seeing that processing was really giving us a small taste of what we know in theory, those those parts of the Israeli state too. And then once we were in prison, there's a scene that I've described in a book chapter and that I think is covered in the zine, that stays with me, and that has really been useful to go back to think about how we operate and do forms of transnational solidarity without simply replicating unknowingly, or in some instances knowingly, the kind of power imbalances and differences that exist when you bring people from very different backgrounds and geographic contexts and class identities, racial identities together. And so that's almost the thing that I remember the most. There were many other things that happened while we were on this flotilla mission, but I don't know if you want me to jump into that. Sorry, I'm going with the story without checking in that I'm answering what you're asking.
No, I think it's great. I mean, I think it's a fascinating story, really interesting. So I don't know if you want to talk now a little bit about the division that happened once you were incarcerated.
Yeah, so once we were there, the point was, I mean, we understood that much of what we could do against such a big force and as a small boat and 13 people was to bring as much media attention uh, to the situation as possible, to draw attention to the ongoing blockade. Uh, and so when we were imprisoned, the point was not to simply sign papers to leave, and that was obviously what people wanted. They wanted us to sign and say that we had illegally entered Israel, and that they were going to deport us as a result. And we had made a decision that we wouldn't do that. That it would be up to them to deport us. But as I'd mentioned before, every step of the way, even inside of the prison, the sense that one got, and this might really only be because of the media attention that had been built, because it was a woman's boat to Gaza, because many of the people on board, like ours, have some kind of media profile because of being an Olympian or being a parliamentarian or being an artist. There were very many different kinds of people that or peace activists. We had a Nobel laureate on the boat. So there was a lot of attention, and we wanted to ensure that we use that attention to as part of the solidarity mission. But then the experience of what felt like a tick boxing exercise around one's human rights started to unfold. And examples of this would be in the space of the 36 or so hours that we were incarcerated, we were afforded the opportunity to see a social worker, psychologist. So individually pulled out of a cell, given this opportunity, reminded that this was being afforded to us as a privilege and so on. We had a bail hearing. We literally went to court. There's a court set up inside of the prison. And it didn't matter that we argued that we had not chosen to come to Israel. The charges were there already, and it was just a tick boxing exercise. We were afforded the opportunity to speak to our consular representatives, wanting to check up on us where we were. And it was in this moment where we ended up in a courtyard that had a kind of holding cell on the end. We were all brought together. The lawyer that was representing us was there, as well as the consular representatives of some of the women, the countries that the women were from, colleagues were from, comrades. And then in this moment, three of us get pulled aside and put into a holding cell, not back to our cells, but a holding cell that's just off from the courtyard, so we can see everything that's happening. Everyone who's in the courtyard can clearly see us. And it's in this moment that, I look at who's inside of this holding cell and who's not. And it turns out that the three of us who are there, two of us are from the continent. the Algerian rep, and myself from South Africa. Two of us are in hijab, the Malaysian doctor and the Algerian parliamentarian. All of us are from the Global South. So we're there, and our colleagues, most of whom are from the Global North, are quite comfortably sitting with their consular representatives, talking, chatting, and this scene just kind of hits me in the sense that one imagines that, I mean, I imagine maybe I'm wrong here, but I imagine myself, if I was one of the people not excluded and locked in that particular way, that the first thing that comes to mind is what's going on here? Why are we segregated? This is the primary way of breaking solidarity. Why are they there? Why am I here? What is happening? And an insistence on making sure that that kind of division isn't amplified, and that we are kind of aware of what is happening to everyone who's part of this collective. So we try to intervene and say this to our lawyers. And it is at that point that you really realize, you're at the mercy of the people who have the guns, who have the uniforms, who have the keys. And so we get told that we can't come out. We've got to stay there. And even though one or two of our comrades come over to kind of talk to us, no one is super outraged that this is happening. And it's in that moment that an earlier conversation that we had before being intercepted comes to the fore. And this is where the conversation didn't go as easily, or where it felt like what we considered to be a unified mission started to show its cracks. Before the IDF boarded us, we'd had this conversation, as I mentioned. What do we do if we land? And what must happen? What message must we take? How do we engage with the people we're wanting to show solidarity to? And that conversation on the boat just kind of re-emerges for me, because the key differences between how we engage people we say we are in solidarity with, between those of us from the Global South who've had to have a more complex reading of what is resistance and how does one struggle against forces that have power and might. How do you do that, and what are the complexities? And on the boat, it was pretty clear that if you had more privilege, to be able to always choose peace, or insist that peace is the right way and the only way, this was often coming from the position of privilege, as it played out in our collective. And then those of us who've lived through places and struggles that had to engage the armed struggle to shift the power imbalances, we were a bit more concerned by the idea of going with a unified idea about what the right message is and how to engage people once we land in Gaza. And so when we saw this, it kind of raised questions around what solidarity can look like when you're coming from very different positions, and then how do you negotiate that in a way that doesn't just replicate the ideas and suggested actions of the state, that is like the status quo. How do you not replicate what's happening in the world inside of your own collectives?
So I know in response to that, as part of the zine and part of the book chapter that you wrote, you came up with an agenda for critical solidarity. And I'm wondering if you might just talk about that a little bit in terms of what do you think are the key
Yeah,
issues of that?
I mean, yeah, there were a couple of things that came up on reflection for me. Um, I mean, difference, I've mentioned that quite a bit. And I also, when I'm teaching or when I'm in any kind of collective uh, context now or process, difference is both key and a resource to understanding the world better and understanding things beyond one's own experience. So one of the suggestions is that we value that difference, but that if that difference has to be critically engaged, and And by that I mean that we we have to recognize difference and value it, but then we need some kind of analysis, in particular on the various structures of power that are influencing how we as differently positioned people will be able to engage with each other. So those two for me work together. And then the other is, once you just having an analysis of power out there, but not understanding how it relates to your own um, positionality and how all of us are positioned in a way that would experience some kind of discrimination, but also some privilege. And so it's also about understanding what's the possibilities of solidarity when you recognize your own privilege. So it's one thing knowing about the systems and the structures and having an analysis is quite another thing to take responsibility and be accountable to the ways in which that's privileged you or even oppressed you, such that it shapes some of your responses to things. Some of the others was, and I also relate this to political education work or any education work, is knowing that if difference is to be valued, but it also creates complexity, we're going to make mistakes. And so to go into most endeavors that involve others with the understanding that we're going to make some mistakes, and that as a result of those mistakes, if we are able to think individually and collectively together about what this means for individuals and what it means for collectives and structure, that we actually have to then also do some work towards repair is one way of thinking about it, but kind of learning from the mistakes that we make such that we are accountable to each other, and that revealing those differences and revealing how those actions have hurt each other potentially doesn't mean the end of our mission, doesn't mean the end of our collective or the solidarity activity, but that it's actually part of the solidarity activity to work on that repair and figure it out together, because in that way we're practicing what it means to do things with others that are risky. And so that's some of the other points were around what is particular about solidarity. And I make the proposition that there has to be some kind of sacrifice, that you have to be giving something, either risking in a big way or in a small way, but that solidarity actually has an essential, it, yeah, sacrifice is an essential part. The doing of something for others, where you have to give something up, is potentially part of, and I think that is a very difficult issue, because we can very easily be propelled to do things that directly affect us. But it's when we're asked to do something for people beyond our experience or beyond our circle or beyond our geography, that it feels like that kind of action needs it needs some work to build that muscle and that understanding. Then I think the other is, I mean, just from a feminist perspective, the more complex way of understanding how power is operating. Some people talk about it around intersectionality, others talk about it as assemblages, but ways in which different structures of power influence us, and that many of us have multiple ways in which we are working against the power dynamics that are around. And then I think this question of solidarity as, of course, when I think about it, it sounds so obvious, but often people do, some people think about solidarity as an individual act of participation. And it's quite important that I think we understand solidarity. It sounds so obvious, but as a collective endeavor, that it's about the collectivity that makes it solidaristic. Maybe, yeah, there's obviously forms of individual action that can contribute to a solidarity effort, but I think it's about building collectivity, a collective project rather than an individual one. And then I suppose as an adult educator, the idea of reflection, the creating of experiments and resisting power, and making mistakes such that we can figure out, repair, and create new ways of being together. So that reflection for me, solidarity, part of building it is having that critical reflective space alone for yourself, but also with other people. And then there's this idea of translation work. And I call it translation work. And I'm just thinking out loud now about how does the translation work? How is that distinguished from forms of creative reflection or critical reflection? But I'm thinking here about how the work is different depending on who you are and what the analysis of the collective is, or of the situation or the issue that you're dealing with. That actually there's more work. I say, especially if you're privileged, there's more work to do if you find yourself in a more privileged position than others, uh, to translate between your own experience, which will have huge gaps because of your privilege. So there's more work to be done to better understand those comrades and those in your collective who are doing solidarity work around you. And then something that came out of the Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall student formation when they were reading Fanon, and I mean, I think Fanon took it from the Bible, this very simple but very difficult to do proposition or invitation that one must put in any condition or in any space that one enters, if you're thinking about what to do about an issue, to consider the last first. So if you've done the analysis and you have a sense of how power is operating, and how these are intersecting and landing on on people. In the instance of the women's boat to Gaza, I would say that critical solidarity would have been ensuring that serious consideration, struggle, and hearing of the woman from the global south, who, through the experience of growing up in that particular condition, would probably have more, would hopefully have more complex things to say about the solidarity action. As in the condition of landing in Gaza and going to have a conversation with Palestinian women, a solidaristic act is knowing that one needs to, shut up and listen as a first, not shut up and never speak, but as an orientation, listen to, as the biblical quote goes, put the last first and the first last, as the centerpiece for how you start a conversation, and always having that as a touch point, because with power and privilege and language and all the things that unfortunately create hierarchies, even as we say we want to be more fair, more equal, more horizontal. As those hierarchies are developed, the opportunities for those more privileged uh, to learn from and try to see what they're not seeing is by listening and asking and making space for others to, in a way, educate. And of course, that agenda raises a whole range of questions, which we have to consider and grapple over. But those were some of the things that came out for me that I felt if we had that agenda, critical agenda, we could have been on a different mission.
Okay, well, I think that's really, it's incredibly helpful in terms of for people in the US trying to grapple with solidarity and with folks in the global south, folks in other parts of the world. And there's so much there's so much of that kind of superiority, that kind of feeling of knowing more than you actually know,
Hmm.
but because you've studied this in a certain context, you there's a tendency for people from the US to think of themselves as experts and not really to listen. And I think when we look at and I think that's part of why the movements have come to not pay any attention to what happens in other parts of the world,
Mm.
because it it's not seen as important. People think, for example, that policing in the US is the issue for the world. And I'm not saying policing in the US isn't an issue, but it's not the issue for the world. You know, there are many other issues, but people get fixated on what their immediate situation is, and they then want to generalize that. And um, that I think that's a that's a challenge that people face in the U.S. if you want to actually build a if you want to build a movement. Um, you know you can't just focus on one issue or focus on one locality or focus on only on race or only on gender, but you have to connect to people in other situations and be willing to learn from them. So I mean, I think your agenda there is very instructive for people in the US, and I hope some people will listen to it and learn from it.
I mean, so from South Africa, we have a similar issue. There's lots of solidarity work on the continent, but often South Africans, because of the colonial legacy and because our transition happened 30 years ago, but the inequality and the structures of colonialism, remain in some ways. We also have this idea that we have. So I think South Africa has a important place in a conversation with the rest of the world. But I think that has a lot to do with how and this is, I think, why Palestine is such an important place in the world at the moment, without arguing that these are places of exception, but they're it feels like we're lagging behind um, where the rest of the world is in a good way. So we look at the US and the global north now, and we see what's happening in universities and what police are doing in relation to Palestinian resistance and solidarity. And we can't believe how authoritarian, undemocratic, and problematic everywhere else is. But we can also start seeing here that if we're not careful, um, that's going to come around our way again.
Right,
And it won't come in the same form. So the forms of nationalism and supremacies will look different, but there are some things that look very similar. So I think we have to be cautious to know that there's something important about what we can hold down in this moment, and we have to defend those things. But the world moment pulls us along in some ways. And I think this is why the US is also so important for us, even as it's a global north. I think a lot of the Black and Indigenous resistance movements and struggles there, we have a relation, and we look to you guys only to see how bad it could become again. When we look to the US, we're like, oh no, some of our in the region, the province or the state that I'm in, it's the Western Cape it's the only province that is governed by the opposition, historically white party. I mean, it's very anti-black and very capitalist, very problematic. But it is looking to the US in ways and importing some of your technologies around policing and others that is quite scary, even around academic freedom and kind of attacking wokeness, attacking the trans community. So in a sense, we're far away and maybe out of time with your authoritarian government versus our democratic one. But there are parts of our state that are also looking, and the authoritarians everywhere are feeling very empowered. And so
right.
it is useful to look to different places and recognize where we are in this continuous kind of permanent revolution, I suppose, permanent moving and trying to defend um, more progressive forms of engagement. Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, Leigh-Ann. Well, I think this has been really a great conversation. I appreciate uh, your nuanced and expansive version of telling the story. I think, we captured it in a zine, which was uh, very much condensed. But I think you've
Yeah.
really connected that story to a whole lot of other issues and a lot of complexities, and given us lots of things to reflect about in terms of our own experience and relating it to your experience with the flotilla. So I really want to thank you for sharing that time with us, and also helping us create this zine, and for reflecting on your own experience on the flotilla in such a profound way. So,
Thank you so much. I love that there's zines being produced. Um, it's really reminding me that we have to get a bit more creative than simply writing book chapters. So thank you for that push. And then for the podcast, there's multiple ways to engage this thing, and it's been really interesting.
right.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you know when this is going to be posted and so forth.